Some encounters do not happen by chance, and sometimes the person who changes your life the most, it is exactly the one that the whole world ignores. Before we start the story, tell us where you're watching us from. Your presence makes all the difference for us. We hope you enjoy the story. It was a clear morning, one of those in which the sun shines brightly, as if to remind everyone that there is always a new beginning. The whole city seemed to breathe energy. Polished storefronts, luxury cars rushing by, people dressed in expensive clothes and weather-conscious faces. Everything seemed to run within an invisible, almost automatic order. But outside the glow, far removed from the flashes and pageantry, there was something that no one was seeing. In the midst of all this, a black car cut the avenues firmly. At the wheel, a young man with an intense expression, an impeccable suit, and a firm gaze. His name was Julian. He was in his early 30s, heir to an empire built with sweat by his parents, and which he now maintained with the same discipline. Julian wasn't just rich. He was admired. People saw him as synonymous with success, as the one who won, the one who had everything. But did he really have? That day, he wasn't going to a meeting. It was not a common commitment. It was his wedding. On the other side of the city, in a church decorated with white flowers that exuded perfume throughout the corridors, dozens of guests waited anxiously. Everything was timed impeccably. The ceremony of the year. The bride, Isabel, was radiant in a dress designed by one of the most renowned designers in Europe. She smiled, but inside, something bothered him. Isabel was no ordinary woman. He had class, beauty, and a fierce ambition. For her, marriage wasn't just about love. It was about image, influence, and power. The perfect union with the perfect man. But time passed, and Julian was not enough. Meanwhile, inside the car, Julian tried to stay calm. The cell phone vibrated non-stop in the passenger seat. It was Isabel, and it was the third time in less than 5 minutes. Something inside him weighed him down, a nuisance he couldn't explain. That strange feeling of being where you shouldn't be, even if everything indicated otherwise. He finally picked up his phone. "I'm coming," he said in a calm voice, trying to contain his anxiety. Traffic is complicated, but the truth, it was another. What happens when fate decides to interrupt your perfect route? Without realizing it, a miscalculated curve, a deviation of attention, and everything changed. The sound of tires skidding, glass shattering, and the impact is dry. In a few seconds, the world turned into silence. Julian didn't see anything else. There, between life and nothingness, a new path began, but he didn't know it yet. As the church plunged into murmurs and suspicious looks, a sudden call brought it all to a halt. Isabel answered in a hurry, and in seconds, her face lost all color. "He's alive, but in a coma. He had an accident. He is at the Central Hospital." The words echoed through the hall like thunder. What was supposed to be the most glamorous day of his life, it became a nightmare. But in another corner of the city, far from the luxurious dresses, away from the champagne glasses and the empty promises, a young woman from humble beginnings walked silently with her simple uniform and eyes full of unspoken dreams. Her name was Lena. It was his first day as a cleaning assistant at the same hospital where Julian was struggling to survive. She didn't imagine that day would change everything. He did not know that when he crossed the corridor with his cleaning cart, he would see a stretcher pass by with an unconscious man, and that his heart would race without explanation. She covered her mouth with her hand, surprised by the sudden emotion. "It's him," he whispered, not knowing why, and that's how it all started. An accident, a silence, a meeting without words, and the seed of something no one expected, the most unlikely and perhaps the truest love that could arise between two worlds so different. But can silent love awaken someone from a coma? What if the only thing he needed to come back was the presence of someone the world didn't even see? The soft smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint scent of white flowers in the hospital corridor created a curious atmosphere, cold, but with something serene. It was there, on the 3rd floor of the emergency ward, that the fates of 3 people would begin to intertwine, slowly, silently, and irreversibly. Lena, with her hands gloved and her eyes attentive, continued to push her cart. He was still getting used to the pace of the new job, the grueling routine, the white walls, and the hurried voices of the doctors. But there was something about that wing that had held his attention since he arrived. The last door on the right. The room where they had just admitted a patient in a coma. The same man she had seen being rushed through the halls hours earlier. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe something bigger. But every time she walked through that door, Her heart tightened. Lena didn't know that man. I didn't know his name. He only remembered the serene, though bruised face, and the way his fingers were parted, as if they were trying to reach for something, or someone. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. On the first night, after finishing the hallway cleaning, she plucked up the courage. He looked around, made sure no one was around, and went inside. The room was silent, except for the constant sound of the heart monitor. There he was, still unconscious, his face pale, his eyes closed. A man the world seemed to have forgotten for a few hours, but not her. She approached carefully. I didn't know why I did that. Maybe it was compassion, or perhaps it was something still unnamed. He lightly touched the end of the bed, as if asking permission to be there, and then, in a delicate impulse, he spoke. Hi, I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope so. Today was my first day here, and for some reason, I think you're going to be fine. It was a simple sentence, but for those trapped in the dark, even a whisper can be a light. In the days that followed, Lena returned. Whenever he could, he entered that room. He would bring flowers from the garden itself and place them next to the bed. He took care of the details, fixed the sheets, and wiped the surfaces, even if there was no dirt. It was as if he wanted to ensure that that place, at least that space, had a little life. Meanwhile, outside, Isabel's world was slowly falling apart. Julian's absence shook his image. She tried to maintain her pose in front of the press, friends, and family, but inside she felt furious. Not because of the pain of almost losing him, but because of the scandal, the party that didn't happen, and the looks of pity he received at social events. Every time he went to the hospital, his visit was quick, impatient, and distant. Julian, though unconscious, seemed to feel the difference. When she entered, the environment became colder and heavier, but when Lena appeared, something changed. On one of these silent visits, as Lena arranged the flowers she had brought, she whispered, I don't know what's going on inside you, but out here, everything is different. I keep coming back, and I don't know why. I just know that I can't leave you alone. She sat down by the bed, took his hand and gently stroked his fingers. In the room, a light breeze came in through the open window. The monitor kept his pace, but Julian's chest seemed to expand a little more. Outside, time passed. But inside that room, a bond was forming. A silent, unlikely bond, and true. After all, what is love, if not the gesture of someone who remains, even when everyone else leaves? Lena kept coming back, day after day, always with new flowers, always with soft words and full of hope. Even if no one else believed it, even if no one noticed. But someone noticed. Inside Julian's mind, there were shadows, distorted images, disconnected sensations, vague sounds, nameless faces. But between all this, there was a voice, a sweet voice who spoke every day, who told simple stories, who sang softly, who said he was strong. And little by little that voice began to become the anchor of something he had already forgotten, the desire to return. Love is sometimes silent, but it may be the most powerful thing there is. And it's just the first part of this story. On the third day since the accident, the hospital corridors were already used to the sound of Lena's light footsteps. Whenever the sun began to sink over the horizon and the movement of the emergency ward decreased, she took the opportunity to visit the room of the person who, unknowingly, already occupied a good part of her thoughts. The routine had been transformed, the work was the same, the schedules were the same, but something inside her had changed. She no longer entered that room just to clean. Now she wanted to be there. I needed to be there. She had developed a silent care, almost like an unspoken promise that he would not be alone, even if he could not answer. Her name she only found out on the fourth day. It was written on a small label hanging at the foot of the bed, Julian Carter. It was a strong name which matched his presence, even in that state of fragility. Lena repeated the name in a low voice, almost as if she were testing the sound. Julian, you'll be fine, she said softly, her eyes fixed on his sleeping face. That night something different happened. Lena brought with her a small blue flower, still damp from the watering she had done at home before leaving for work. He placed it in a glass beside the bed. There were no vases available there, but she didn't care. The important thing was that that flower was present as a sign of hope. As simple as the gesture was, there was something magical there, because that morning, as silence took over the hospital, Julian's fingers moved slightly. It was not enough to get the attention of the doctors. No alarm sounded, but for those who watched with an attentive heart, It was more than an involuntary movement. It was an answer, a sign. The next day, Lena returned early. Her anxiety to see him again had grown, and although she could not explain why, her chest was racing. As soon as she entered the room, her eyes searched for the flower. She was still there, firm, and the glass seemed to have been moved slightly. Lena looked at Julian. He was still unconscious, but there was more color on his face. Something about him seemed more present. She came over, pulled up her chair, sat next to him, and held his hand for a few seconds. Then, unhurriedly, he began to speak. He spoke of the time, of his childhood in the countryside, of the times he sang with his grandmother while they watered the garden. He shared simple things, but they were full of meaning. Today I remembered a beautiful place where we used to plant violets. It was quiet, full of birds. I think you'd like a place like that. He smiled. Julian didn't answer, but inside him, something stirred. Somewhere between the confused dreams and the faded sounds of reality, he heard fragments of that voice. He didn't know where she came from or who she was, but there was something about her that calmed him. It was like an anchor thrown in the middle of a storm, a voice that said he was safe. On the morning of the 6th day, while Lena was cleaning the corners of the room, a doctor came in to check Julian's vital signs. She was silent, as she always did. But before leaving, the doctor looked at her curiously and commented, "Curious? His heartbeat has been reacting better in recent days, almost as if he were responding to something." Lena just smiled. He did not answer, but his heart beat faster. That night, she did something different. I brought a song, a soft melody that her mother sang when she was a child, with simple words and slow tempo. He hummed softly as he arranged the flowers and passed the cloth on the side table. Then she sat down and sang to him, as if talking to someone who was fast asleep, but could still hear. And Julian listened, not with the ears but with the soul. That feminine voice, charged with sweetness and truth, was like a beacon in the midst of darkness. And little by little, like a root growing under the earth, something inside him began to change. On the 7th night, the hospital was particularly quiet. The fine rain outside trickled down the windows in slow drops, creating a soft, almost hypnotic soundtrack. It was as if time slowed down just on that floor, in that room, in that story that no one but the two of them seemed to notice. Lena entered slowly, as she always did, but this time he was not carrying flowers. He carried in his hands something even more intimate, a letter, a folded sheet of words she had written carefully, as if she were putting part of what she felt but couldn't say out loud. She sat down by the bed, took a deep breath, and began to read. "Dear Julian, I know you don't know me, and maybe you never will, but even so, I wanted you to know that there's someone here, someone who believes you'll come back, someone who is rooting for it every day." The words came out in a low but firm voice. Lena did not hesitate. It was as if each sentence was part of a bridge she built between the two. "I see so many people pass by, and few stop to look. Sometimes the world is like that, too rushed to see what really matters. But I saw you. On the first day, I saw you pass by on a stretcher, and for some reason, my heart stopped. I don't know how to explain it, but from that moment on, I knew you needed someone, and I needed to be here." She folded the letter slowly, placed it inside a simple envelope, and left it in the drawer of the bedside table, next to where the blue flower still resisted, alive. It was a silent gesture, a secret just the two of them. And then, for the first time, she had the courage to get even closer. She leaned her fingers on his carefully and instinctively said, "If you can hear me, just shake my hand. Just a little bit." Nothing happened in the first few seconds. The heart monitor kept its rhythm steady. Julian's body remained motionless, but as she was about to let go of his hand, something subtle, almost imperceptible, happened. His fingers moved, not a spasm, not a reflex, but a touch, light, weak, but present. She widened her eyes, barely breathing. Tears pooled immediately. It was real. He had heard it. He was there, caught between two worlds, but listening, feeling. The next morning, the doctor came in and did the routine tests. He analyzed the graphs and checked the signals. Suddenly, he frowned. "Interesting. There was a small change during the night. The levels are more active, as if he had tried to react to something." Lena, on the other side of the room, pretended not to know anything. He just smiled discreetly and continued his work. But inside, his heart couldn't fit in his chest. That small reaction had changed everything, because where there was only silence, now there was response. And where there was doubt, there was now faith. The following nights, she didn't stop. He came back every day, always with a new story, a new song, a new gesture of care. Sometimes, I just held his hand and stood there in silence, as if offering shelter without having to say a word. She took care of the small details. He adjusted the pillows and passed a damp cloth on his hands to refresh his skin and massaged his fingers gently, as if each touch was a way of reminding his body that it still existed. On one of those days, she took a small box with an old portable radio. He played soft instrumental music, one of those that soothes even the most wounded heart, and as the melody filled the room, she said, "That was my dad's favorite song. He always said that music can play where words can't reach." And it did. It touched inside Julian, even though he still couldn't open his eyes. Those notes were absorbed as if they were drops of life. Outside, no one noticed what was happening in that room. To the doctors, he was just another patient in a coma. For the employees, just another bed occupied. But for Lena, that man had become a part of her life. And for Julian, that woman was the link between his unconsciousness and the chance to return. Because sometimes love doesn't need grandiose declarations, nor of eternal promises. Sometimes it builds itself in silence, in daily care, in the sound of a song, in the light touch of a hand. And in that room, love had already begun to transform everything. Outside the hospital, the city followed its hurried course. The windows continued to shine, the luxury cars circulated, and the plastic smiles stamped on their faces at events full of appearances. It was as if nothing had changed, as if Julian's life was not suspended between silence and return. As if he were still active in social circles, signing contracts, posing for magazines, and fulfilling expectations that never really belonged to him. Isabel, his fiancée, was the perfect reflection of this world. From the beginning, she had dreamed of an impeccable union, a cinematic wedding, full of important guests, plentiful tables, and a party that would leave everyone talking for months. For her, the commitment to Julian was always more than feeling. It was status, image, and control. In the first days after the accident, she attended the hospital frequently, but the visits, which were supposed to be emotionally charged, seemed more like a formality. She arrived with firm steps, high-heeled shoes echoing in the corridors, and a striking perfume that betrayed her presence even before she opened the door. She sat next to him for a few minutes, crossed her arms, cast a cold glance at her motionless body on the bed, and murmured short sentences without much emotion. "I hope you wake up soon. We have a ceremony to reschedule, remember?" Sometimes she wouldn't even turn off her cell phone. She sent messages, checked social networks, and made calls in low voices, organizing events and solving decoration details, as if it was all just a setback, a delay in her impeccable schedule. Meanwhile, inside the room, flowers withered. The ones she brought had no smell or bright color. They were chosen to impress, not to comfort. The room, once full of life with Lena's presence, became cold every time Isabel appeared. It was as if the place had lost its soul. But what makes someone really present? It was this question that hovered invisibly between the white sheets, between the silent walls and the thoughts of a man who, even unconsciously, seemed to perceive the difference between those who loved him and those who just said they did. Julian, trapped in his own body, felt it, not with the common senses, but with that which goes beyond. Intuition, sensory memory, soul. When Isabel entered, it was as if everything was blurred. When Lena was by his side, the mist lifted. On the 10th day, Isabel arrived angry. A photographer from a local magazine had published a story about Julian's absence from the latest social events and hinted at a crisis in the engagement. This had made her furious. His visit that day was not out of care, but out of strategy. "You need to get back soon. This story is affecting our image. I'm tired of answering questions and making excuses." She said all this looking at her own reflection in the phone's viewfinder. He didn't even touch his hand, and before leaving, he dropped a bouquet of artificial orchids on the table. On the same day, a few hours later, Lena entered the room. He brought with him a small vase of freshly picked daisies. She placed it carefully by the bed and smiled when she saw that even there, in the midst of so much coldness, something beautiful could still grow. She sat down and started talking to Julian about simple things. He talked about a book he was reading, about a strange dream he had the night before, about a cake recipe he would try to make for the weekend. Small shares, but which carried something that cannot be bought: presence. The difference between the two was subtle, but glaring. On one side there was brilliance, luxury, interest and control. On the other, there was sincerity, surrender and pure feeling. And, little by little, this was felt. Julian, even without opening his eyes, seemed to react more vigorously when Lena was present. His body warmed up, his heartbeat stabilized, and the air in the room changed. Because sometimes, the true essence is not in what you see, it's in what you feel. In the following days, the difference between the two presences became increasingly clear, and although no one spoke about it out loud, the small gestures revealed everything. The nurses began to notice that on nights when Lena stayed longer, the monitors recorded slight changes in Julian's neurological pattern. It was nothing that could be used as clinical proof of improvement, but it was constant enough to cause curiosity and, more importantly, hope. Lena, on the other hand, did not seek recognition. I never wanted to be noticed. He walked through the corridors with gentle steps, avoided eye contact with superiors, and when he needed to enter the room, he did so with the respect of someone who understands that he is taking care of something sacred, even if silently. Meanwhile, Isabel kept showing up, but less frequently. His visits became even shorter, and his behavior became more and more impersonal. On one of the days, she arrived accompanied by an image consultant. They talked outside about how to deal with the press, while Julian stood motionless inside the room, like a forgotten piece of an empty window. The consultant asked, "Are you sure he'll wake up? I mean, it's been too long." Isabel replied with a shrug and a sigh. "If you wake up, great. If not, life goes on. I'm not going to stop everything because of this." And that sentence, spoken in an impatient whisper, was heard by Lena, who had just folded the clean sheets at the nurse's station. It was no surprise. It did not cause shock. It only confirmed what his heart already knew. She returned to Julian's room that night with even firmer steps. She looked at him for long seconds, as if trying to understand how far his words had reached. He sat next to him, held his hand as he always did, and said sincerely, "I'm no one important. I don't have a famous last name nor expensive clothes, but I'm here, and I stay because I want to, not because they expect that from me." After that, she was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was that kind of presence that doesn't need words, just to be. The hours passed. Outside, the city was sleeping. At the hospital, the lights were being turned off. In the bedroom, only the dim wall lamp and the rhythmic sound of the devices remained. But something was different. The atmosphere was no longer cold. There was heat. It made sense. And then, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Julian moved his head. Not much, just a few millimeters to the side, but enough for Lena to notice. She stood up immediately, frightened and hopeful at the same time. "Julian, are you there?" His eyes were still closed, but the breath became stronger, deeper. She didn't scream. She didn't run for help. He just approached and said once again, "If you listen to me, just know that I'm here. And that all this, it is not an obligation, it's a choice." On the other side of the glass, a nurse passed by and saw her next to the patient. He made a point of calling her to finish his tasks, but something stopped him. He watched for a few seconds and went on his way, understanding without understanding why that moment should not be interrupted, because there is a huge difference between being present and simply showing up. Lena, with her simple uniform and tired hands, had done more than any expert, any bride, or any luxury visitor. She had touched something that no one else had touched, the essence. And in that room, between the sound of the monitor and the calm beating of the heart, something was awakening. Something that could not be explained with medical reports, but that could be felt right there, in the air. If you're feeling it too, if something in this story is touching your heart, enjoy this moment and leave your like on the video. This helps more than you think to keep stories like this alive. The 14th day dawned with a light breeze passing through the window curtains. The city was still waking up, but inside that hospital, the stillness already had a different weight. There was anticipation in the air, as if something invisible was about to happen. The silence was no longer one of waiting, but of anticipation. Lena arrived earlier that morning. He had his hair tied up in an improvised way and a thin coat over his uniform, as the temperature had dropped. He brought with him a new bouquet, picked before sunrise. They were not fancy flowers, but came from the ground where she laid her hands every day. Each petal had its story. Each color carried an intention. She entered Julian's room without a sound, as she always did. The first thing he did was check if the blue flower he had left days ago still resisted. And yes, it was there, firm, as if it were part of that place, as if he had found the strength to continue just by being next to someone who, even unconsciously, conveyed something different. She approached slowly and observed Julian. Something about him was changed. There was no longer that completely absent expression. His features were softer, more alive. It was as if, little by little, his soul was returning to the body. "Good morning," Lena said with a shy smile. "Today I brought sunflowers. They say they always look for the light. I thought maybe this would be good for you." He placed the new arrangement on the table, wiped the corner of the bed with his damp cloth, and pulled out the chair to sit next to him. He took hold of his hand, as he did every day, and began to tell him the news of the morning. The cafeteria's coffee burned again. The nurse on the third floor cut her hair, and there is a patient who talks in her sleep. Last night she sang an entire song in French, and he barely knows how to speak English. It's funny, isn't it? She laughed to herself, but as she looked at Julian's face, her eyes widened for a moment. A movement, small, almost imperceptible, but real. His fingers moved, not as an involuntary reflex. It was different this time. There were two firm touches. And then, seconds later, the eyelashes twitched. Lena leaned forward, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Is it there?" he whispered, feeling his heart racing like never before. His eyes began to open, slowly, heavily, as if the act of seeing the world again required an almost superhuman effort. But he succeeded. His eyelids lifted, and for the first time in weeks, Julian's eyes stared into the light. The room, until then silent, seemed to light up. Lena felt the tears come before she could even say any other words. She squeezed his hand lightly and saw that he returned the gesture, even if with little force. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You're back. You're really back." Julian tried to speak, but there was no sound, just the lip movement. Slow, flawed, as if your body was still relearning how to function. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. The heart monitor went off in small oscillations, catching the attention of one of the nurses passing by in the hallway. Within seconds, 2 doctors entered the room. They examined his vital signs, tested reflexes, and called his name. And even with limited answers, Julian reacted. As everyone moved around the bed, checking machines, taking measurements, and looking at the numbers with surprise, Lena walked away discreetly. He leaned against the wall, observing everything with his heart still racing. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want them to know anything. What she felt at that moment was more than joy. It was the confirmation of something he always believed in. Care, when it is true, can touch places that science does not reach. Because miracles don't always happen with flashes in the sky or supernatural revelations. Sometimes the real miracle is the persistence of someone who chooses to stay when everyone else is gone. And in that modest hospital room, a miracle was happening. But it wasn't magic. He was human. The news spread through the hospital faster than any official statement. The whispers in the corridors, the astonished looks of the professionals, and even the faint buzz in the nurse's break room announced what seemed impossible. The patient in room 28 had opened his eyes. Lena, despite being emotional, remained discreet. I watched from afar as the doctors recorded Julian's first signs of consciousness, without interrupting, without claiming any kind of credit. He knew that moment was his, and deep down, he felt that he had already received his share, the confirmation that his presence, his words, his gestures had come to him. While the exams were done, Julian kept his eyes half open. He seemed to struggle against the thick fog that still enveloped him. The voices around him echoed as if they were underwater, and the faces seemed to float undefined. But through it all, there was a presence he felt clearly, one who was not screaming his name nor asking for explanations. It just existed there, lightly. Hours later, when the doctors withdrew and the movement stopped, Lena returned to the room. He opened the door slowly, holding a white rose with the ends dyed light pink. It was a rare flower from her garden, and she had decided that if he ever woke up, it would be the first flower he would see. Julian, still struggling to move his head, slowly turned his eyes in his direction. When he saw her, the muscles of his face contracted into a faint smile. Weak, yes, but true. Lena held her breath. That look said everything that words could not explain. She approached, and in a soft voice said, "You're back. I knew I would come back." Julian tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice, still recovering, did not allow it. Still, her lips moved with effort. It's real." It was almost a whisper, But Lena listened, and that was enough for her tears to escape without resistance. She nodded with an emotional smile. "Yes, I'm real, and I've been here since the beginning." They stayed there for long minutes, just looking at each other. No need for explanations, without great speeches. It was as if time was finally at the right pace, as if the entire universe had held its breath so that this reunion could happen. Meanwhile, outside, Isabel arrived at the hospital with hurried steps. When he heard that Julian had woken up, he rushed to regain control of the situation. Her mind was already planning the resumption of the marriage, the statements to the press, and the return to social networks. But there was something she didn't know yet: the man she would meet in that room. It wasn't the same one she'd left unconscious days ago, because Julian, even though he was still recovering, had tried something that cannot be taught nor bought. He had felt the quiet power of one who remained, and that changed everything. When Isabel came in and saw Lena by the bed holding her hand, her face froze for a moment. But before she could say anything, Julian looked at her with a calm but firm countenance. "You came," Isabel smiled, forcing naturalness. "Of course it does. We need to talk about a lot of things." But Julian didn't answer. His attention turned to Lena, and though his words were still scarce, the gesture was clear. He shook Lena's hand tighter. That, for him, was more than a choice. It was a statement. That night, after everyone had left, Lena was alone with him for a few minutes. She arranged the pillows, changed the water in the vase with the rare flower, and placed the rose right in front of the bed. He sat down in the chair as he had done before and held his hand once more. "Rest, you're slowly coming back, and I'll be here tomorrow," Julian answered with his eyes, a glow that did not come from the light in the room, but from something much deeper: gratitude. And it was there, in the silence of that early morning, that the true miracle was revealed, not as a spectacle for crowds, but as the gentle response to the insistent love of someone who chose to believe when no one else believed. In the days that followed, Julian began to regain not only the movements of his body, but also the clarity of his own feelings. It was as if the coma had silenced the outside world so that he could hear, for the first time, what came from within. What was once a life based on automatic decisions, rigid commitments, and expectations of others now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. He would spend hours looking out his bedroom window, watching the clouds change shape, the branches swaying in the wind, and the colors of the sky at dusk. Things that I never noticed before, things that, somehow, now made sense. Lena was still present, but now as an official part of the routine. Although she was still the cleaning employee, the nurses began to treat her with more respect. Some smiled when they saw her enter the room. Others only recognized with their eyes the importance she had had in that process. One day, while adjusting Julian's pillow, one of the doctors made a comment that stuck in everyone's minds. "There are medicines, equipment, and techniques, but there is something that medicine cannot explain: the constant presence of someone who cares. That changes everything." Julian, still in a weak voice, replied, "She was my medicine. No one else worked like her." These words were heard by Lena, who was in the hallway changing the water in the bucket. She did not enter the room immediately. He just leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, trying to contain his emotion. I knew that was sincere. It was not a formal thanks nor a polite kindness. It was a truth born from the depths of someone who, for a long time, did not allow himself to feel. And therein lies the beauty of the human essence, the ability to recognize the value of the other, even after everything falls apart. Julian no longer thought about the newspaper headlines, the social events, or the lavish trips he had booked with Isabel. All of this had lost its flavor. What remained now was the memory of a soft voice that spoke to him when he could not answer, and the care of hands that touched without asking for anything in return. On the morning of the 21st day, he asked to write. He was still weak, but with effort, he held a pen and wrote a few words on a notebook sheet that Lena had left on the table. There were few lines, with trembling letters, but loaded with meaning. "Life has given me everything that the world considers success, but it was only in silence that I discovered what really matters. You gave it to me without saying that you could, and now I don't want to miss it." Lena read that note hours later, when she returned with a new bouquet. When she finished, she closed her eyes, touched by something she never expected to live. The connection between the two was not made up of promises nor grandiose plans. It was made up of small but true gestures. Julian no longer saw Lena as the hospital employee, She was, for him, the living reminder that the greatest treasures of existence do not shine, they flourish. Isabel, on the other hand, remained distant. After realizing that his presence no longer had an impact on Julian, he began to appear less. When he came, his behavior was always the same: superficial, impatient, and mechanical. On one of these visits, when he realized that Lena was in the room when she entered, he let out a venomous comment. "I see you've made friends with the cleaning staff. Always so nice, isn't it?" But Julian didn't respond with sarcasm or irritation. He just said, "Do you know what saved me? The humanity you've never tried to understand." That ended the conversation. Lena, embarrassed, made a point of leaving the room, but Julian held his hand. "Stay, please." And it was thus, day after day, that the true essence of both was revealed. Julian, once trapped in a life of appearances, now allowed himself to feel. Lena, accustomed to being invisible, was finally seen, not through her eyes but through the soul of someone who had woken up differently. That week brought something different for Julian. He was no longer the comatose patient, nor the distant executive who led meetings behind tinted glass. Now it was just a man trying to rediscover what made him really alive. Every detail mattered: the smell of the flowers Lena brought, the sounds of footsteps in the hallway, the soft tones of her voice as she told stories as she tidied up the room. He had begun to associate the little things with his recovery. I no longer saw the world as a list of goals to be fulfilled, but as a sequence of moments that, if well cared for, revealed beauty even in routine. On a calm afternoon, as Lena helped rub a cream on his hands, he looked at her intently. "Did you know that he told me things even when I couldn't answer?" She paused for a second, surprised. She knew that he had awakened, that he recognized her, but she still did not imagine how much she remembered. "I wasn't sure if you heard, but even so, I kept coming." Julian smiled, with that kind of smile that comes from the bottom of his chest, light and honest. "I listened, not with the ears, but I felt everything." At that moment, the silence between them was more significant than any words. It was as if they had finally reached the same point in the journey, the recognition that their connection went beyond logic, function, and social role. It was the truth of the heart that spoke louder. Meanwhile, the outside world behaved as usual. Isabel began to appear only when the press began to speculate about Julian's condition. His visits, now clearly strategic, were accompanied by impeccable clothes and cell phones always in hand. He took discreet selfies and registered his presence as if that were enough to keep his image intact. But inside that wall, something much more valuable was happening. Julian had asked Lena to bring him a blank notebook. He wanted to record everything he felt, and each page written was a discovery, not about business, profits, or prestige, but about who he was when the world around him stopped demanding performance. He wrote about the day he realized that the perfume of natural flowers was more powerful than any imported fragrance, about how the simplicity of a true conversation surpassed any rehearsed speech, and about how Lena's humility carried more value than all the false compliments he had heard for years. One day, while she was watering one of the plants they had placed in the bedroom window, he said something that made her stop in the middle of the gesture. "You're the first person who saw me." "For real?" She turned around, not fully understanding. "What do you mean? Everyone always saw what I represented. The surname, the business, the image. But you—" He looked at me as if I were just a human being. Lena smiled, touched by his sincerity. It was as if each word gave her back something that, for years, had been denied her: value. That night, as she packed her things to leave, Lena looked at Julian with a special twinkle in her eye. "Tomorrow I bring something I wrote. I want to show you before he decides to return to his world. This one, it's the world I want now." Time inside seemed to slow down. Each exchange, each silence, each smile had a different weight. They didn't need to explain themselves. What they built was something that no one could see from the outside, but inside, it was already immense. And so, day after day, Julian relearned what it meant to be himself. Not the businessman, not the fiancé of the perfect woman, not the icon of high society, but someone whole, with flaws, with real feelings, and, above all, with the courage to choose a new life. If you have come this far, and also believe that our essence is not in what we wear or what we have, but in what we offer to the other with sincerity. So this is the right time to support this story with a like. It shows that you value real connections, just as they have learned to. Julian's body was stronger, The movements no longer required the same effort, and the voice, previously hoarse and faltering, began to regain firmness. But it wasn't just the physique that was changing. There was a new glow in his eyes, a different presence in his words, as if he were being rebuilt from within. The truth is that he had been reborn, not in a poetic sense, but in a real sense. He survived the accident, the absence and the abandonment, and woke up to something bigger than his own survival, the opportunity to start over, a new chance to live, not the way they had always expected him to live, but the way that now made sense. It was strange to think about it. Before the coma, his life was occupied by meetings, quick decisions, important contracts, and relationships based on mutual interest. Now his days were filled with comfortable silences, fresh flowers, sincere words, and small gestures from someone who never expected anything in return. Julian felt he couldn't go back to who he was. One day, while having his breakfast with the help of a nurse, he asked for a pen and paper. I needed to write. I needed to record every detail of what I was feeling, as if putting it on paper was a way of not letting all that get lost over time. He didn't want to forget how Lena's silent presence was his anchor. He didn't want the rush of life to make him erase from his memory the nights when that calm voice was his only company. On the blank sheet, he wrote, "Life pushed me to the bottom, but it was there that I found the one who reached out to me. Waking up was more than opening my eyes. It was deciding to see it differently, and I choose not to go back to where I was." Later, he showed the text to Lena. She read it quietly, sitting by the bed, holding the sheet carefully as if it were something sacred. His eyes filled with emotion, but his reaction was simple. He returned the paper, held his hand, and nodded. They didn't need big statements. The connection between them said it all. Meanwhile, Isabel, realizing that she was no longer welcome, tried to maintain some semblance of control. He scheduled meetings with advisors, released press releases saying that the wedding would be postponed due to a medical decision, and posted old photos with captions that masked reality. His strategy was to keep the audience distracted with the appearance of normality. But Julian had already made his choice, and it wasn't just an emotional choice. It was a conscious decision, built day after day. He no longer wanted to live a story set up to please others. I wanted a real life, with real roots. After completing a month since he regained consciousness, Julian was discharged. The hospital staff prepared everything with care. Some employees, even without really knowing him, went to say goodbye. Many of them not for who he was before, but for who he had become inside. On the way outside, a luxury black car was waiting for him. Isabel was behind the wheel. She wore sunglasses, high heels, and an impeccably cut dress. When she saw him, she immediately went downstairs, went to him with hurried steps and tried to take his arm. At last. "Now we are back to real life. Let's go home. I already have everything organized." But Julian didn't move. He just looked around, as if looking for something more important. "Is Lena here?" he asked. Isabel frowned, disconcerted. "That cleaning lady? Why do you want to see it now? We have a lot to solve. Our life together." He interrupted her in a firm but serene voice. "This is no longer my life. I had time to think. Too long. And today, I want to start over from scratch, with the right people, in the right place." Isabel was silent. For the first time, it seemed to have no response. He tried to keep his posture, but his eyes gave away his frustration. Julian thanked the doctors, hugged some nurses, and excused himself to leave alone. He walked slowly, leaning on his temporary cane, to the reception. There he looked with his eyes, until he found her. Lena was sitting on a low-key bench, her uniform simple, and her hair tied up in a makeshift bun. When she saw him, she immediately stood up. "Are you okay?" He smiled. "I am, because you taught me how to stay." She approached, her eyes moist with the lightest smile she had ever given. "What now? Are you going back to your old life?" Julian looked at her for a moment, then looked away from the sky, which was beginning to open after a light drizzle. "No, now. I want to build a new one." That same afternoon, when leaving the hospital, Julian did not return to the mansion. She refused the driver, ignored the appointments that her secretary insisted on resuming, and hung up her cell phone. For the first time in a long time, he chose silence. He walked slowly through some nearby streets, like someone who rediscovers an entire city with new eyes. Lena, on the other hand, hesitated to accompany him. He felt that this moment was his, that this walk meant more than just leaving a building. It was a rite of passage, a break with everything that no longer made sense. But when she saw him standing in front of a flower stall, admiring with delicacy the bright colors of an arrangement of lavenders, she approached. He said nothing. He just stood by his side. And at that moment, neither of them needed words anymore. Julian bought a small bouquet and handed it to her shyly, almost as a silent thank you for everything. Lena picked up the flowers and smiled, her eyes teary. "No one has ever given me flowers before," he said with a slight blush on his face. "Then let this be the first of many times." In the days that followed, Julian decided to move away from the old cycle of life altogether. He cancelled his marriage to Isabel in a discreet and definitive way. Instead of interviews or official notes, he just sent a handwritten letter with few words, but all sincere. There was no hurt, just an honest end to a cycle that no longer fit in its new version. He returned to the house where he grew up, a place forgotten by time, where the furniture still kept the smell of childhood. There he found family albums, old letters from his parents, simple objects, but full of history. Sitting in that modest room, he realized that the essence of what really mattered was never in the ballrooms, nor in the contracts signed, but in the memories built with truth. Lena began to visit him frequently. Their conversations evolved naturally, always surrounded by care, without haste. They talked about books, recipes, childhood, and unfulfilled dreams. She said that she always wanted to study nursing, but never had the conditions. He listened attentively, not as someone who wants to solve it, but as someone who wants to walk together. "Do you still want this?" she asked on a rainy afternoon, as they shared a cornmeal cake she made. "I do, but I'm too old to dream." "Then let's grow old dreaming together." It was not an exaggerated promise. There was no ring, no eternal vows. It was just a phrase said by someone who understood that life doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable. Sometimes it just needs to be true. Over time, Julian gave up the business. He set up a small community project in a remote neighborhood where children from humble families could study, learn music, and take care of plants. He named the space Garden of New Beginnings. There, Lena began running simple earth care workshops, using her talent with flowers to teach children that everything grown with love blooms, including the soul. And it was there, in the midst of the wet earth, dirty hands and sincere smiles, that the two built a new story. No luxury, no audience, only with the certainty that they had chosen each other, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. One late afternoon, sitting under the shade of a tree they had planted together, Julian held Lena's hand and said, "I never thought that being reborn was possible, but here I am." And it all started with a woman who was talking to an unconscious stranger, as if he still had a future. She looked at him, teary-eyed. "You were never a stranger to me. I just didn't know that yet." And that's how two lives intertwined, not by fate nor by force of circumstance, but by choice, for the courage to start over, for the boldness of leaving what was comfortable behind in search of something deeper. Second chances don't arrive wrapped in expensive gifts. They are born discreetly, sometimes in the corner of a hospital room, in the touch of a hand that no one sees, in a voice that insists on staying even when no one is listening. And perhaps this is the beauty of life. When you have the courage to start again, you can discover that the best is yet to come. 5 months had passed since Julian was discharged from the hospital. The transformation that began quietly, inside a cold room, was now visible to anyone who encountered it. His face remained the same, but there was another man behind that look. Someone who learned to recognize value where before she only saw routine. Someone who now moves by intention, not by obligation. The Garden of New Beginnings was already a living space with flower beds, children's laughter, singing voices, and people reconstructing personal stories. Julian coordinated the administrative and financial activities of the project, but without hiding behind a desk. I walked with the volunteers, cleaned tools and watered the plants together with the students. He had left his suit behind. Now he wore jeans, a simple shirt, and comfortable shoes. Lena, in turn, had officially left the hospital. Even with proposals to continue working in other sectors, she preferred to continue with him, not out of dependence but out of conviction. He was happy to finally dedicate his days to something he believed in. The gardening workshop, which started with 3 children and 2 broken vases, was now one of the most sought-after activities. She taught with her soul, with lightness, always smiling, even when the days were tough. The two have never announced a formal relationship. There were no public requests, parties, or ceremonies, but those who observed from the outside knew. It was clear. The way they looked at each other, how they took care of each other, how they laughed at the little things. They belonged to each other, not by a document, but because they chose each other every day. From the first one, she sat next to his bed without expecting anything in return. One Saturday morning, while Julian was pruning the edges of a hedge, a reporter showed up at the community center. It had been sent by a local newspaper to do a story about the transformation of the former millionaire involved in a cancelled marriage scandal. She arrived with a microphone, camera, and rehearsed questions. "Mr. Carter, what was it like to come out of a coma, break up with your famous fiancé, and reappear in this new role?" Julian dropped the scissors, wiped his hands on the cloth hanging from his waist, and replied calmly, "It was the best thing that happened to me." The reporter insisted, "But you left behind a fortune, a life of luxury. Don't you regret it?" He looked at her for a second and replied bluntly, "Regret is continuing in something that doesn't represent you. I chose to leave." The journalist tried to approach Lena, who was with a group of teenagers teaching them how to prepare mint seedlings, but she smiled, politely declined an interview, and went back to what she was doing. "I didn't want fame." He never wanted to. Days later, the article came out. Instead of sensationalist headlines, the newspaper published, "Man survives accident and exchanges luxury for purpose. She was the one who brought me back." The report went viral on social media, but neither of them commented on it. They continued their lives as before, oblivious to the spotlight. Julian, out of respect for what he had experienced in the hospital, made one last visit to room 28. The space was now occupied by another patient, but he went in, looked at the walls, the place where the chair was positioned, and discreetly placed a small envelope on the table. Inside, there was a letter and an artificial blue flower, the same species as the one Lena had taken on the first day. "If you're reading this, maybe you're going through something difficult. I was here too, and someone who didn't know me stayed by my side until I had the strength to go back. So here's my advice. If someone sits next to you in silence, listen with your heart, because it could be the beginning of your new life." He left the letter, left the room, and never returned. A few days later, in the late afternoon, while cleaning the downtown courtyard, Julian saw Lena helping a child replant a small sunflower. The girl had dropped the seedling, and the earth had spread all over the floor. Lena, without any hurry, bent down, picked up a handful of soil with her bare hands, and began to patiently rebuild the vase. The child, smiling, imitated her. It was a common scene there, but for Julian, it was like seeing in an instant everything he'd been searching for years. He walked up to them, crouched down next to them, and without saying anything, placed his hand on hers, helping to finish the planting. Lena looked at him with that same hospital gaze, firm, gentle, full of truth. "I never imagined I'd get here," she said. "Me neither. But now that we're here, I don't want to leave anymore." That phrase was not a distant promise. It was an affirmation of the present, an acknowledgement that new beginnings don't always happen like in the movies, with great soundtracks and slow-motion endings. Sometimes they arise in the subtle touch of the earth in the hands, in the care of a fragile plant, or in the simple act of staying. And so, between seeds, roots, and hands that learned to rebuild what was broken, Julian and Lena went together, without having to prove anything to anyone, just living. And if you think the story ended here, maybe you still have one last thing to discover. Time passed, and like everything that is built calmly, what seemed unlikely took solid shape. The Garden of New Beginnings, which was born from a simple idea, was now a reference in the region. People from different backgrounds came there to seek not only knowledge, but also relief, connection, and opportunity. Julian and Lena were at the forefront of it all, not as unreachable leaders, but as a living part of what they had helped create. They didn't have to explain the story to everyone who passed by. The truth could be felt in the environment. Anyone who observed the two together noticed something different. It was more than a partnership. There was complicity, a connection that was formed without haste, in the midst of pain, in silence, when no one else believed. Julian kept his life out of the spotlight. He turned down invitations to interviews, awards, and documentaries. He even said no to a proposal to adapt his story into a mini-series. He didn't want his recovery to become entertainment. What she experienced with Lena was too real to fit into a TV script. There was no room for glamour where it all started with simple flowers, low voices, and calloused hands. On a sunny morning, while they were organizing a plant fair with the children of the center, Lena received a call. It was from the hospital where he had worked. One of the old nurses called to tell them that a new patient had arrived in critical condition. young, without family, without close friends. And the curious thing was that, during the screening, he asked, still conscious, if someone like that girl who helped the millionaire wake up could be around. Lena was startled. How did anyone know? How had that story come to be there? The nurse explained, someone found the letter and the blue flower in room 28. The message was read and passed from one patient to another until it became a small legend within the hospital. Many did not know who had left them, but they spoke of that story as if it were a hidden truth, as if that room had kept a valuable secret. Lena hung up the phone quietly. He told Julian what he had heard. He listened without interrupting, then took a deep breath. Do you still feel you should go? She thought for a moment, then replied sincerely, not because I have to, but because someone reached out to me one day, and I know how much it can change everything. The next day, Lena returned to the hospital. He entered the hospitalization ward, now renovated, and went straight to the room where the new patient was. When he opened the door, he found a young man with his eyes closed, with a pale face, tubes and monitors around. For a second, the image transported her to the past, but now she knew what to do. She sat next to him, took a glass of water, and placed a flower inside, not a blue one. This time, a white daisy. And with the same calmness he had with Julian, he began to speak. He told about the garden, about the small daily miracles that no one sees, about a child who learned to smile by taking care of a plant, about the strength of those who insist on returning when the whole world has already left. Outside, Julian was waiting for her. She knew that was part of who she was. I didn't feel jealous or insecure. On the contrary, I felt proud, because he understood that true love is not possessive, it is generous, and he had learned this from her. At the end of the afternoon, the two returned home together. They walked side by side, in silence. But between them, there was a conversation that did not need words, a silent agreement that everything they lived was worth it, and that second chances only make sense when they are shared with those who understand the value of starting over in the right way. Lena stopped in front of the gate of the house and looked at him with a slight smile. Do you remember what you said when you woke up? Julian frowned, trying to pull from memory. Is it real? She laughed. Yes. And now you know that miracles are not magic. They smell like flowers, have a low voice, and their hands are dirty with dirt. Julian laughed with her. He touched her hand with affection, intertwining his fingers with hers. And if someone asked me today what saved my life, I would say it was the quietest love that ever existed, the kind of love that asks for nothing but transforms everything. On the porch, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, they sat together. There was no more urgency. There was no fear. There was only now, and the certainty that even when all seems lost, there is always a way back, as long as there is someone willing to stay until the end. Because in the end, the stories that really touch us are the ones that show that life can be rewritten, that love can be born in the most unlikely place, and that second chances are real. All it takes is for someone to believe enough to stay when no one else stays. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to the channel to help our channel grow and not miss the next story. See you in the next videos.